For 34 years, he walked through those factory gates every single day. Then the CEO's son called him into the conference room and said, "Frank, we need fresh blood in safety management. Your old school approach is slowing us down." He quietly nodded his head and said, "Understood." But what Derek didn't know was that his father had signed a contract in 1989 stating that not a single machine could operate without the safety director's written approval. Frank Morrison was 59 years old, and this was the story of how 34 years of dedication ended with a handshake, and how a forgotten piece of paper brought a $50 million steel company to its knees. He had started at Morrison Steel Works in 1989 as a junior safety inspector. Back then, Harold Morrison ran the company with an iron fist and a deep respect for the men who worked the floor. Safety wasn't just a department, it was Harold's obsession. Too many friends had been lost to industrial accidents in the early days, and Harold swore it would never happen on his watch. Frank wasn't flashy. He didn't make speeches or shake hands at industry events. He was the man who made sure workers went home to their families every night. For 34 years, Morrison Steel Works maintained a perfect safety record under Frank's watch. 0 fatalities, 0 major injuries, a track record that became legendary in the industry. Harold Morrison had trusted Frank completely. Every major equipment purchase, every protocol change, every safety decision went through Frank first. Harold often said, "Frank doesn't just manage safety, he is safety." When Harold Morrison suffered a heart attack in 2022, his son Derek stepped in as CEO. Derek was 35 years old, MBA from Northwestern, full of ideas about efficiency and modernization. He'd spent 5 years in consulting before joining the family business, and he brought all the buzzwords with him. Derek saw Morrison Steel Works as outdated. The safety protocols were too strict. The procedures were too slow. The workforce was aging. In his mind, Frank Morrison represented everything that was holding the company back from reaching its full potential. The first warning sign came during Derek's second month as CEO. He brought in efficiency consultants who spent weeks analyzing every department. Their report was damning. Excessive safety protocols are creating unnecessary bottlenecks and reducing productivity by an estimated 15%. Frank tried to explain that those protocols existed for a reason. Each one had been written in response to a near miss or an accident at another facility. But Derek wasn't interested in history lessons. On a cold Tuesday morning in March, Derek called Frank into the conference room. There was no small talk, no acknowledgement of Frank's decades of service. Derek got straight to the point. "Frank, we've decided to restructure the safety department. We're bringing in a younger team with fresh perspectives. Your approach has served us well, but it's time for change." Frank sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. He'd seen this coming for months. "We're offering a generous severance package," Derek continued. 6 months' salary and full benefits. We think it's fair." Frank nodded once. "When do you need my badge?" Derek seemed surprised by the lack of resistance. "End of week would be fine." Frank stood up, shook Derek's hand, and walked out. No arguments, no threats, no drama. Just the quiet dignity of a man who'd given his best years to something that no longer wanted him. That afternoon, Frank sat in his kitchen, going through the box of personal items from his office. At the bottom, wrapped in an old manila folder, was a document he hadn't looked at in years, his original employment contract from 1989. He'd forgotten how detailed Harold had been. The contract wasn't just about salary and benefits. It outlined Frank's authority and responsibilities in exhaustive detail. And there, on page 7, was a clause that made Frank smile for the first time in months. All production activities, equipment startups, and operational procedures require written authorization from the designated safety director. This authorization cannot be delegated or transferred without explicit written consent from both parties. Harold had insisted on this clause after a competitor's facility had suffered a catastrophic accident when safety protocols were bypassed. It was Harold's way of ensuring that safety would always have the final word, no matter who was running the company. Frank called his lawyer, Tom Bradley, who'd handled his divorce years earlier. Tom read the clause twice. "Frank, this is ironclad. As long as you're the designated safety director, nothing moves in that plant without your say-so. But I've been terminated. Have you signed anything acknowledging termination of this specific contract?" Frank thought for a moment. "No. Derek just talked about restructuring the safety department." Tom smiled. "Then legally, you're still the safety director, and they still need your authorization." Frank didn't call Derek. He didn't send threatening letters or demand meetings. He simply waited. Monday morning came and went. Derek's new efficiency measures were being implemented. The consultants had recommended combining safety inspections, reducing documentation requirements, and streamlining approval processes. By Tuesday afternoon, Frank's phone started ringing. Derek's assistant, then the plant manager, then Derek himself. Frank let them all go to voicemail. Wednesday morning, the lawyers got involved. Morrison Steel Works legal counsel called Tom Bradley directly. "We need to clarify Mr. Morrison's employment status. There seems to be some confusion about his ongoing authority." Tom's response was simple. "Review the 1989 employment contract, Section 12, subsection C. Then call me back." By Thursday, Derek was desperate. Production had ground to a halt. The new safety team couldn't authorize equipment startups because they weren't designated in the original contract. Workers were standing idle. Deadlines were being missed. Derek called Frank directly. "Frank, this is ridiculous. You've been terminated. You can't hold up production over paperwork." Frank's voice was calm, measured. "Derek, I'm not holding up anything. I'm simply following the contract your father signed. We'll sue you for interfering with business operations. You're welcome to try, but I'd suggest reading that contract first, really reading it." Derek hung up, but called back an hour later. "What do you want?" "I want what your father promised me. Respect for the work I do and the authority to do it properly." The negotiations took place in Tom Bradley's office. Derek sat across from Frank, flanked by two corporate lawyers who'd spent the previous day reviewing every clause of the 1989 contract. The terms were simple. Frank would return as Director of Safety Operations, with full authority restored and a 5-year contract extension. His salary would be increased by 20%, and he'd have final approval on all safety-related personnel decisions. Derek's efficiency consultants were politely shown the door. The new safety team was reassigned to other departments. Frank Morrison was back in charge of the one thing that mattered most, keeping people safe. 6 months later, Morrison Steel Works landed the biggest contract in company history, a government infrastructure project worth $200 million. The client had chosen Morrison specifically because of their perfect safety record. Derek never acknowledged the irony, but Harold Morrison sent Frank a handwritten note. "Some things are worth protecting. Thank you for protecting what matters." Frank kept the note on his desk, right next to a copy of the 1989 contract, not as a threat but as a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought with quiet dignity and forgotten paperwork. In the end, Frank Morrison proved something that efficiency consultants never understand. Experience isn't just about knowing what to do. It's about knowing what not to do and having the wisdom to stand your ground when it matters most. Sometimes the best revenge isn't fighting back. It's simply being right.